Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Martin Andrews, Creative Director at Inquire Ed. It is so great to have you join us for today's webinar, Storytime in Social Studies, using picture books across an inquiry. Now, today's webinar, I can't believe it, is the final webinar in our Spring Deeper Learning series presented by the National Council for the Social Studies and Inquire Ed. So normally I'd advertise the next webinar here, but you need to stay tuned for our NCSS and Inquire Ed fall series announcements. And in the meantime, if you have suggestions or ideas, you can email webinars@inquireed.org. And you can always go to inquireed.org/webinars to view our past series and just keep up to date. As I mentioned, the webinar is brought to you by the National Council for the Social Studies. Now, the National Council for the Social Studies has stuff going on throughout the whole year. Their annual conference is in Washington in December, but they have a lot of events, academies, institutes going on in the summer. You're going to want to check that out. If you go to socialstudies.org, professional development, upcoming summer programs, you're going to see a range of both in-person and virtual events that they're having. So check that out. It's a great way to connect and keep improving practice over the summer. The webinar is also brought to you by Inquire Ed. Inquire Ed supports teachers with high quality instructional materials that make joyful, rigorous, and transferable learning possible for every student. Our social studies curricula, Inquiry Journeys, K-5, and middle school world history are used across the country to help students build deep content knowledge and develop the inquiry skills that are essential for a thriving democracy. You can always find out more at inquireed.org. Reach out. We'd love to talk about social studies and inquiry-based learning. I am excited to introduce Kim Perry Cummings. Kim is curriculum design lead at Inquire Ed. Kim, why don't you turn on your camera? Kim, it's so great to have you here today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks, Martin.
So I guess the first question for you, why picture books in a social studies classroom in the first place?
That's a great question. So I'm a reading teacher at heart, so I have come to love social studies later in my career, but now I would like to believe that I hold both of those things. And I think picture books are just fantastic. I think the majority of us on this call probably can name a picture book that's stuck with us from childhood, something we love reading with a niece or a nephew. And in a social studies classroom, picture books are just amazing entry points for our students. So they're engaging. They've got great illustrations. They have rich narratives and rich stories. So they're something that students can get very excited about. They also spark a lot of curiosity. So students might be able to see characters that they can connect to or that they wonder about. Um, they can be great to use so that you can revisit a topic over and over. Um, Picture books are just so nuanced and so rich. So I think we often think about picture books for K1, 2, but really I think even for older students, because they're so rich, you can really go back to them and look at for different levels of meaning as you go. I think the other thing that's so important is that they also allow students to really think about perspective taking. So I like to think of books as, windows and mirrors. And so students might be seeing themselves reflected in a book. And they also might be seeing experiences that are unfamiliar to them, which builds empathy and trust and respect in a classroom. And I think that also helps to support all learners because of the way in which picture books provide such a robust wealth of experiences through words and pictures. And then last but not least, words and pictures. I mean, there's just tons of opportunity for literacy development with picture books. And in a social studies classroom, I think we are responsible for also building students' literacy skills. And there's just such a beautiful way we can do that with picture books.
Yeah. Just while you were talking about promoting perspective taking, it's really that's up to curriculum designers and teachers too for when they're curating those books to think about how what are the books that they're bringing into their classroom so that students do have mirrors and windows. Um, that's great. I know
100%.
that you're excited to talk about picture books across an inquiry, but I also know that you're really excited because we have a very special opportunity to look closely at one book in particular, Apple Pie, 4th of July. And we're so honored to be joined today by its author, Janet Wong. So, Janet, if you can turn on your camera, I'm going to stop our share for right now. Um, Hi, Janet. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me here, Martin and Kim.
Yeah, it's so great to have you.
I'm
Um,
so
I'm
excited.
I'm going to read a little bit about you. You've written over 40 books for children and teens, and your stories often explore identity, belonging, and what it means to be a part of community. And we get to hear you're a poet. We want to hear about your current projects, and we want to dig into this wonderful book, Apple Pie, 4th of July, and how stories like this can help students reflect on their own experiences and communities. It's so great to have you. And I know we've got a bunch of questions we want to ask. So
Great.
I know Kim is chomping at the bit to ask some questions. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Martin. I definitely am. So Janet, I know your book back and forwards, and I've read it so many times, but I know we probably have some folks on the call who maybe are not as familiar with the story of Apple Pie 4th of July. So I was hoping you could just start by giving a quick summary of that text, since we're going to be talking about that text throughout the webinar.
Sure. The super quick version is Apple Pie 4th of July is about eating Chinese food on the 4th of July. And when I meet people and they say, "Oh, so tell me about your books," that's just the one line that I give them. If someone wants to know a little bit more, I'll say, "Well, my parents owned a mini mart in rural Oregon that sold Chinese food to go. And I did not grow up as a child in that store, but I grew up working in our other businesses that we had, little small family businesses in California. By the time they bought the store in Oregon, um, I was already an adult, but I did serve time in that store because whenever I would bring our son to visit, they would go fishing, they would go crabbing, they'd take a drive somewhere, and I was stuck in the store working at the store. And I really do actually pity the people who had to eat the food that I cooked for them. My father usually would make enough food, and then right before lunch, my mom, and my son, their grandson, would go off on a ride somewhere, and I would just hope that no one would come in so the food would last. But every once in a while, I actually had to cook the food too.
That's so funny. Oh my gosh, thanks for sharing that. Um, I'd love to hear you share a little bit more about what inspired the story, in terms of your own personal story, and your own experiences with culture and identity in particular.
Sure. So what inspired this story was on the 4th of July, 1996, way back when. I was living here in Washington State, where I am now, and I called, and my father answered Tri-City Market, and I said, "Pretty slow today, right? 4th of July, no one's coming in, right?" And he said, "Oh, it's busy." And I said, "What? Ice, matches? What are they buying? Like for a barbecue, right?" And he said, "No, Chinese food, and it's busy. I got to go. Bye." And when I hung up, I thought, wow, I can't believe my parents are cooking and selling Chinese food on the 4th of July, this all American holiday. Don't they know better? And then I realized, wow, who is being a little bit narrow in thinking about what it means to be American? I was the one being very narrow. And in this town where there were almost no other Asian families, people were turning up for Chinese food on the 4th of July.
Mm.
And I was so impressed, so amazed, that I just felt like I needed to write a book about how a community can come together and show us that everyone belongs.
What you spoke to there just makes me think about why we were so excited to think about using this book in our curriculum because of the way that it brings in different aspects of the inquiry that we're working on. So thinking about culture, students learn about culture, they learn about traditions, and then there are social studies standards where they need to learn about national holidays. And so one of the things that I'd love to get your perspective on is thinking about how do you think about those things as coexisting? So thinking about family traditions or cultural traditions that people bring, which I think you were just speaking to, and then how that coexists and intersects with national holidays, given that it's a book about the 4th of July.
Right. Well, the 4th of July, I think by definition is an inclusive holiday, is one where we're meant to embrace each other. Everyone who lives in America should be proud to be an American. And then we come up to the inquiry piece, which is what makes someone American, right? What does it mean to be American? And when we talk about that, we could look at it from just a strict social studies point of view about these are the requirements for
Mm.
citizenship, and this is how you become a citizen. And then you could pull in that Dave Eggers and Sean Harris book that you featured, "What Can a Citizen Do?" Right, and just talk about citizenship. But I think really to explore it a little deeper, a little bit more on a personal level, we need to talk about our family traditions and where our families come from and what we all do in term that make us who we are, right?
Mm.
And you could take any holiday, but the 4th of July is a good one, I think. And you'll get people saying, "Well, on the 4th of July, we eat tamales." And my family comes together, my all my cousins, my aunts and my uncles, and we eat tamales, and then we play soccer on the grass. Maybe you'll have somebody else who will say, "Oh, we are just burgers and dogs, burgers and dogs," and we spread out potato salad, all kinds of things on a picnic table. And then everyone just jumps in the swimming pool until it's dark. And that's what we do. Everyone might have something different, but a lot of people will have something in common. And
Mm.
some of the kids will say, "You know what? We eat apple pie. Our 4th of July is all about the pie." And in my book, the apple pie that they eat at the end of the book is 100% my mom. My mom was obsessed with apple pie on the 4th of July. And it was not a proper 4th of July unless we had that apple pie, because she loved it so much. And it just was very meaningful to her. And she was born and raised in Korea. I'm half Chinese and half Korean. My mom came to this country when she was in her 20s and became a citizen. And I think that I don't know. She's unfortunately she's no longer with us, so I can't ask her, but I don't think she ever ate apple pie as a child. I think this was a new thing.
Mm.
I think that this was her new part of her new American identity, was that on the 4th of July she ate apple pie. So I did.
That's great.
So I grew up
I
doing it.
love I love that story, thinking about the text and how her identity embraces both the apple pie and the traditional foods. So that's just so lovely. Um, Another thing, we're going to talk about how we've used the book in our inquiry in a little bit on the webinar, but we put it in the context of thinking about what makes a strong community. And one of the reasons we loved your book is that the community that the characters are in, I would say that's such a beautiful and strong community when you see what happens over the course of the text. And so I'm just curious if we're thinking about using this text in a social studies classroom, what would you want students and teachers to notice about the community in the book?
Well, I think that um, pretty much all communities have people who ultimately want to support each other.
Hmm.
And it's ideal when it comes up in a very natural way. And in the book, the customers come into the store, and that they don't consciously say, I want to be inclusive and go and eat Chinese food on today, the 4th of July. They like the food at the store, and they come on in because they're open-minded, and they realize that they can eat anything they want on the 4th of July. They can do anything they want, and celebrate in so many different ways. And so one of the things that was important to me was just to show that the community is naturally supporting the family, that the family is naturally part of the community. And I think that for some kids, sometimes you'll feel alone. You'll feel like, gee, I really stick out. I'm not sure that I belong. And you won't realize that actually you do belong. And actually, there are a whole lot of people who like you and who embrace you and who accept you for who you are. And so this book is just like, you talked about it being from different perspectives. From the child's perspective, and for children who feel like they might sometimes be left out, or might be left behind, or might be a little isolated, I want them to think, maybe I'm not. Maybe people really are there for me. I just didn't realize it, or I don't realize it yet. And then for people who are part of what is considered the mainstream of a community, I want those kids to think, I don't always have to do the same old thing that we've always done. I can think in different ways, and I can look around and see who I'm curious about and who I want to get to know more about, and I can be welcoming. And so it's not that complicated. It's just about welcoming each other and knowing that we are welcome.
That's great. Well, speaking of not complicated, what advice would you give to a teacher who would be using apple pie 4th of July, maybe for the first time in their classroom?
Well, what's funny, actually, years ago, I was doing a program in Lafayette, Indiana, where I was choosing different volunteers to do different things and asking questions in order to isolate a smaller group of volunteers, because I had so many kids to choose from. And I asked this question. I said, well, who here eats Chinese food on the 4th of July? And this was a very non-Asian group of kids. I think that it was pretty much 90% white kids. And so many hands went up in that assembly audience. And I thought, no, really? You really eat Chinese food on the 4th of July? Maybe you will. Maybe you will now that you've read this book. The next 4th of July, you'll ask for Chinese food. But I can't believe that, 150 of you have been eating Chinese food on the 4th of July. But I would say to teachers, it's not weird to bring in some different kinds of food, because actually some kids might never have seen chow mein. I've been to schools where teachers have told me, you might be the first Asian person that these kids have ever seen. And so it could be kind of fun if you have a place like, a Chinese food to go place in your town, to go get a little combo box, a combo tray, and to bring it in and say, this is kind of like what the author was talking about in Apple Pie 4th of July. And you don't have to give them your food, because then we get into all kinds of things with food allergies. But it could be super fun and funny if you say, well, I'm just going to eat this food. But look, you guys talk. Let me ask these questions. And then you just start eating the chow mein noodles and the sweet and sour pork while they're watching you. And what you've done just by doing that is said to them, you've normalized it. You've said,
Mhm.
this food is great. And you don't have to think of this food as other. This food is what I like. And if you're not Asian, that will send a message, especially to your youngest kids. Um, I remember when I was in fifth grade, my mom said I could have a friend over for Sunday brunch. And I was so excited because I didn't often get to have friends come over, but I had a friend, my best friend, come over, and she was a little late, so the food was already out on the table, and it was wonton noodle soup, my all-time favorite food, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, wonton noodle soup. And she looked at my food and she said, "Ew, noodles
Mm,
for breakfast? Don't you eat normal food?" And
mm,
then, and I felt so small, and I felt so hurt.
mm,
And later on, many years later, 20 years later, I wrote a super silly poem that was in my first book, a book called Good Luck Gold. It now is available only in the version that says Good Luck Gold and More, which tells the story behind each poem. And the poem is super silly. Noodles for breakfast, noodles for lunch, noodles for dinner, noodles that crunch, noodles to twirl, noodles to slurp. I could eat noodles all day. Burp. All right. Super silly poem. But what I wanted to point out was noodles for breakfast
mhm,
is perfectly okay. And so maybe you bring in some foods and you have your kids, you can even have this little tradition. Okay, this is Friday late lunch. And I am your teacher, and I'm going to eat for 3 minutes. I'm going to eat my Friday late lunch. And
mm,
today it's Indian food. And last week it was Chinese food. And next week it's going to be a vegan lunch, because every once in a while I feel like eating a vegan lunch. And then you explain what it means to be
mm,
vegan, right? And
yeah.
just exposing our kids to more things. Uh,
Mhm.
Sometimes
I
people talk about food being like a tourist version of culture, but I don't think we need to say that in a bad way, because food is a really integral part of culture. And for instance, even though my mom is Korean and grew up eating Korean food and cooking Korean food, when she came to this country, married to my father, who is Chinese, she learned how to cook Chinese food because my Chinese grandparents owned a Chinese restaurant in Los Angeles. So she learned to cook the Chinese American staples like chow mein and egg foo young. And when I was a kid in, I guess I was fifth grade, in fifth grade, maybe fourth grade, our school had an international food fair. And my mom, who never felt that she was uh, welcome at a PTA meeting and never went to a PTA meeting because she didn't feel she had anything to contribute. When I came home and I told her, we're having an international food fair, do you think you can send something? She was so excited, and she decided, even though we were really poor and we didn't have a lot of extra money for groceries, she decided she was going to make egg foo young, and not a little bit of egg foo young. The morning of the food fair, she got up at 4 in the morning. She made
Mm.
like a full table of egg foo young.
Oh, wow.
And I was so embarrassed. But then the egg foo young disappeared from the table because she was a really good cook, and everybody loved it. And I was so proud. So you know
Mm,
what? The tourist approach to
mm,
culture and social studies can work. And if you can have something like an international food fair, if you can bring that up to your PTA and say, hey, why don't you consider this, and invite parents to contribute if they feel like it. Um,
mm.
I think that these little things can go a long way.
So I want to talk about how you, and then I want to bring Janet back as well, but I want to talk about how you're thinking about this over the course of 3 lessons.
One way I think the integration works so nicely is that as students are reading a book like Apple Pie 4th of July, for example, and they're digging into it and they read it 3 times, they're not only looking at a national tradition like the 4th of July, but they're thinking about the society and the culture of our country, which is made up of so many different cultures. So when students read Apple Pie 4th of July, they've thought a lot about how traditions connect people, and connect is one of the vocabulary words that we focus on as a tier two word that we want students to develop and use in their speaking and eventually in their writing. And what they notice in Apple Pie 4th of July is that the girl doesn't feel connected. There's a part of the text where she feels alone and she feels separate and different from everybody, which is kind of like a puzzle. Like, why is she feeling this way on a holiday? Like, usually holidays, 4th of July, fun, fireworks, parades, music. And so it's this sort of juxtaposition of like maybe what we're expecting to see a character experience and how we might expect a character to feel, but the reality is that she feels pretty alone at the beginning of the text. And then by reading that multiple times, students can really trace that character change and how her feelings change over the course of the text. By the third read, we have them really look at a page where they are looking at the girl at the beginning of the text, and analyzing a couple of images, and they're thinking about how does she feel at this point in the text? Does she feel connected? And she doesn't. And then by the end, they look at an image and they think about, okay, now she is, and why is that? But before we even get there, there's a lot of background that they've built. So we've got background about the 4th of July. We start with primary source images. We start with photographs that kids are likely, 4th of July is a holiday kids are likely familiar with, to surface what they notice and wonder and how that connects to what knowledge they already bring. Then they watch a video where they build knowledge, background knowledge about the 4th of July, specifically why we celebrate. So, really thinking about hitting some of those standards around the founding of the country's history, to get into, before we even get into the different traditions we have, well, why do we even have them in the first place? And then they read the text for the first time. And that first reading is really just a do you understand what's happening in the story kind of read. We don't get deep into culture. We don't get deep into how the girl is feeling. It's more of a just, you know, what's happening with the characters? Where are they? When is it? Which, reinforces the idea that traditions happen at special times. So 4th of July is an annual marker for when we have some country traditions. And then what's happening in the text. And that's pretty much all they do through the first read. And then we go deeper with subsequent reads.
And then after reading, they're processing through creating this story map where they're
Mhm.
drawing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is really connected to ELA standards, but we're having students retell a story by focusing on the key elements and details of a text. So in this example, we use the 4 Ws, which sometimes are the 5 Ws, but we are not getting into why here. So again, just naming who is in the text, who is this, who are the characters, when does it take place, where are they, and what are they doing throughout the day. And by having those quick 4 questions that students can draw and then talk about, we're
Mhm.
building their vocabulary, we're building their oral language skills, we're ensuring that they have a solid understanding of what's happening in that text, so that when we get into the next read and we start looking at the traditions that are happening and why the girl is feeling the way that she's feeling, they already have a foundation to go deeper.
Mm. Um, One of the things that I know that if you are around young kids, if you've had young children, that you know that they will get hooked on a picture book and ask you to read it 3,000 times, so much so that you, as a parent, you're like, I can't take it anymore. Um, what I love about multiple reads of this over 3 days is that it mirrors what kids do naturally. Janet, that idea of rereading, is that something that you've seen a lot of? Is that something that you hope will happen with the books that you write? Talk to me a little bit about that rereading.
Sure. Um, Actually, uh, there was a study. I think it was possibly Michigan State, maybe about 5 years ago or pre-pandemic, so 6 years ago, that asked college students, how often do you listen to your favorite songs per week? And it the study showed that students said that they listen to their favorite songs over 100 times per week
Hmm.
and up to 500 times a month, their favorite songs, right? And it used to be that the way poetry was taught way back when, we'd always ask students to memorize poems. And I think that some kids love doing that, but I don't advocate it. I think that extreme rereading of a text makes it part of them, so they'll remember that poem, or they'll remember that part of a picture book, and that text will become part of them, that message will become part of them. And then later on, when they are feeling alone and they're 35 years old, they'll remember that poem, or they'll remember that part of the picture book, and they won't feel alone. They'll remember what they learned way back when they were in first grade. Well, one thing that I did want to point out that I love about reading Apple Pie 4th of July multiple times is that each time you read it, you can focus on something new. So for instance, you can focus on the part where I write, well, in the book, it says, "No one wants Chinese food on the 4th of July, I say. Fireworks are Chinese," father says, and hands me a pan full of sweet and sour pork. Well, you can turn that into a very quick research project. You can just take out your phone and just type in fireworks, Chinese, invention, and the AI overview will say fireworks originated in China, with early forms being natural firecrackers like bamboo stalks thrown into fire. And then it'll go on, and then you can talk about how we can evaluate different websites and different sources and say, okay, well, this website, which is the US China Embassy website, says that Li Tian from Liuyang, central China's Hunan province, worked hard and invented firecrackers, blah, blah, blah. And then maybe that will lead into a discussion with older kids about how do we evaluate the information that we find on websites. How do we know that he worked hard? Well, why do they say that he worked hard? Maybe it was an accident that he invented firecrackers, like the Post-it notes were a happy accident. So I think that when you do the multiple readings, you can explore different little pieces of the text. You don't have to revisit the same topics each time. Just revisit little teeny pieces of the picture book text that you want to focus on that minute.
I think that's so right. I feel like just that line that you just said, Janet, speaks to me so much. As an adult reader who has read and reread that text, as a curriculum writer, that line always jumps out at me, because I think it's in that moment that the father is acknowledging, no, like, our culture matters here. It's not just that fireworks were invented in China, which is an important, like, I think it can drive all of the research you just named, which is what's so cool about how we can leverage picture books in so many ways. But it also connects to the idea that, we are made up of so many different cultures in this country, and they all have a place, and they all bring something valuable. And in the inquiry that we design, that's actually the first part of the inquiry. So students come to this text having done a whole part of the inquiry, thinking about how are people in a community similar and different. And even though we have all of these differences, and how are we might be different based on our personalities or our skills or what we like to do or the cultures that we have. So they look at culture as one aspect. They have that knowledge that they're then bringing to this text. So the first read is really just about understanding the story. But then the second, and if you do a third read, you can focus on those really nuanced parts of the text that also connect to prior knowledge that students have built, and to reinforce deeper meaning in the text related to just the idea of, like, everyone's culture fits here, right? Like, on the 4th of July, you can eat Chinese food because that's part of the American story, right? Like,
Right,
and so
right.
I think that's just, I love that line in the text. I'm so glad that you mentioned it in this webinar.
Well, and Lauren in the chat made a fascinating comment. She said, as to background knowledge, it would be great to include where China is, a very basic thing for some kids, especially primary students, right? Where China is. So you have the geography lesson there, and where Hunan province is, where the fireworks inventor was from. And when we talk about Chinese culture, China is a huge place, and the kind of food that they eat in southern China is different in many ways than the kind of food that they eat in Beijing, right? And so for older kids, you can explore so many different aspects of the question, what is culture? And for instance, what is Chinese culture?
Yeah.
On this second day, when you go back to the book, Kim, one of the things that I love is that they use that story map from the day before to sit with a partner and retell the story. And that's really exciting to me. I don't ever remember doing that as a kid in a classroom, but you talked about, um, Janet, how that story becomes part of you. Well, now you're retelling it too, and I think that synthesis happens even greater in that. And then you do something interesting, Kim, is you have this timeline. Talk to us about the timeline, and I'd really want to ask Janet about it too.
Yeah, so the story takes place over a single day on July 4th. And the girl has a variety of feelings across the day. And so we have students really pay attention to how is the character feeling at different points of the day, and how do we know that based on the words that the author is using, and based on the illustrations in the text. And so that's a very clear, like ELA target. We want students to really think about character change over time, because often when a character changes, it's a clue to us as readers that there's a lesson to be learned. And here we need kids to get that character change because it's deeply connected to the themes of the text. And those themes are deeply connected to the social studies understandings that we want kids to deepen and understand, related to culture, related to diverse traditions in a society and how they can coexist, and related to how, even with having such diverse traditions and cultural foods and celebrations, we can all still be united by a shared tradition. And so that character change is really important, for us to both get to the deeper meaning of the text from an ELA standpoint, but I think even more so for a social studies, to really deepen understanding of why does this text matter in the first place? Like, we don't want to just read it for character change, right? We actually want to read it because even for us as adults, it has really valuable, meaningful messages that we can think about and apply to our own lives.
Janet, what was the idea of structuring it around that the rhythm and the flow of a single day?
I think it was pretty simple. I was thinking, I'd had that conversation with my father in the morning. I was shocked that they were cooking Chinese food to go, and that people were actually coming, and I just thought, that's enough for the story. One of the things that my mentor, the poet Myra Cohn Livingston, taught me was, in her view, the best poems or the best stories were really about one thing. You chose one thing to write about, and then you said it as simply and clearly as you could. And I think that when we're teaching kids to write, focusing on or holding up as mentor texts, poems or very short picture book texts that focus just on one thing, make it really easy for kids to replicate that kind of very clear, concise writing. So I'm not sure that I thought really deeply about it, but that's how I was taught. I was taught you might have 10 million things to say, but try to limit it to one or two or three things. But there was something I wanted to point out. Especially when you share this book as a read aloud, just a 3-minute read aloud, you just can breeze through the book as a 3-minute read aloud with older students. One thing to touch on, and I was a history major at UCLA. I got my BA in history. One of the things to touch on is the idea that history is a recording of perspectives. And it's not necessarily that the community has changed, but the girl's perception of her place in the community has changed in the book. So in the very beginning of the book, she's feeling really alone and left out, but it's not as if the community has done anything to isolate her. She just, it's her perspective that she's not really part of the community. And then later on, it's not necessarily that the community has changed. It's her perspective of her place in the community that has changed, because she sees that, oh, these customers who have come on other days are here even on this all-American holiday.
Yeah, I think that really happens too, Kim. I think in the third and final lesson where you're really looking at how she changes over the course. Just really quickly, the end of this day two, you have them writing two sentences, supporting their writing. I love that even at this early stage, you're having them support their writing with evidence from as pictures. Could you talk a
Yes.
little bit about that?
Yeah, so this part of the inquiry, one of the language and writing skills that we're really focused on is using evidence, which for young learners, we're calling it using details from the text to support your ideas and your thinking. And so this is going to be a beginning of first grade unit where writing, kids can say and talk and draw a lot more and a lot faster than they can construct sentences. And so we do have them with sentence frames help them write sentences that so they can think about the girl at the beginning and the girl at the end. But then for the evidence, they're drawing because we want them to be able to explain, why did she feel this way at the beginning? How do we know she felt bored or kind of lonely and kind of alone versus like excited and full of pride that people were at the store? So we want them to use their drawings as a way to then be able to speak about the text with evidence, because that's something that as kids get older, they'll need to actually, write with textual evidence. And in social studies, to support claims, they'll need evidence. So this is an ELA skill, it's a social studies skill, it's a life skill that our students need. And so definitely, even for our youngest ones, they should be developing those skills for sure.
Yeah.
Kim,
Um,
Martin, if I can just add on
yeah, go ahead.
add to what Kim said. I think that drawing is such a great pre-writing tool. And in one of my favorite poem writing exercises, which is where you take someone in your family and you turn that person, using metaphor and simile, turn that person into a plant or an animal or an object, something loving. And kids will pick things like, oh, my mother is like a flower. And the next step, after they come up with an idea, I don't have them draw or write when they're coming up with the idea, but after they've come up with the idea, then I have them draw it. And when if the idea is my mother's like a flower, while they're drawing, they're automatically in their pre-writing coming up with details. They have to decide, is she a rose in a vase, like a gift of love? Is she a sunflower because she's following the sun? Is she a tough dandelion growing in up from the cracks in a sidewalk? They're making all these decisions. Is she a delicate, expensive orchid? As soon as they start drawing that flower. So they don't even realize it, but then words are popping into their minds. And then when I say, okay, now it's time to write, they are ready to take off and write, because the drawing has been a pre-writing exercise and has filled their brain with details.
Oof, I love that.
100% love that.
Love that. Talk us through this last lesson, Kim.
Yes. We actually start this lesson with a quick vocabulary review. And I think I shared that I didn't go through all of the stuff that led up to this, but students learn a variety of vocabulary words, one of them being connect. And they've also learned tradition. They've looked at family traditions. They've looked at community traditions, and Apple Pie 4th of July. They're kind of looking at both family culture and a national holiday traditions. And so they do a quick review. And I think I shared this earlier. Part of that is because the vocabulary word connect is so helpful for students to think about how the girl is feeling and why she's feeling how she's feeling and how that connects to the central message. So then students again do another read of the text, but they don't reread the whole text on this day. They're really looking at a couple of pages, and they're very closely looking at the words on the pages and the illustrations. So one is spread of the text where you see the girl kind of sitting on different stools and she's all alone and the day is kind of, just boring, and she just doesn't feel like connected to anything that's happening around her. She just kind of feels by herself. And so they look at that and they think about that, and they also think about what she says. And that's the part of the text before that. She tells her father, I think, is the one who's cooking, like, no one wants Chinese food on the 4th of July. It's 4th of July. And I think this goes to what Janet says. The girl's changes over the course of the text. Her perception changes, her perspective changes. She has this misconception that Americans on the 4th of July do American things, but really what she learns. And so then we have them look at a page in the text later where the store is filled with customers, and you see in the illustration the bright, beautiful smiles on the girl's face and her family's faces and the customers' faces. And so we tie this back to the word connect again, because here we can see the girl does feel connected. And it's interesting because she feels very connected to both her family, who she is helping to serve the food, and she feels very connected to the people in the store because she now feels like they're a part, they're a part of her experience on the 4th of July, which is at the store at this point. And we use that to help students think about, what does she learn? What did she learn about her community through this day?
Mm.
And what she learns, and I think, Janet spoke to this, is that um, there are many different cultures in our country, and even on national holidays or when we have shared traditions, we can still recognize and celebrate and appreciate our own cultures, and other people in our community can also appreciate and celebrate those cultures, because part of what makes this country is that it's made up of so many different people who have contributed to the fabric of this nation. And so I think she sees herself as a part of the American story, basically, by the end of the text. And Janet, jump in if that's incorrect, but that's how I read it as an adult reader. And so, we use the multiple reads. By the time you've done those reads and you've really closely analyzed those images and you've reinforced the vocabulary that students have been working with across 10 lessons, they're ready to actually have that discussion, to think about, well, what does she learn? And then what can we learn now when we think about the 4th of July? And someone says to us, like, what's the 4th of July all about? Is it, like, when you think about 4th of July traditions, should we think so narrowly, or can we think
Mm.
expansively about how we may all, we all are celebrating this shared history of our country, but we can recognize that there are differences among us that we don't want to get rid of, that we want to include and continue to honor our cultural backgrounds. On this day too, students will actually get to see a video where Janet will speak about the text and share a little bit more about why she wrote the text. So they'll bring that to the discussion as well. So they've been, it's been carefully crafted to bring them along in a journey, and not to like give them the answers in that journey, but to help them bring their own experiences to the text, think about a variety of, primary sources that we've looked at, texts that we've read, what we've read leading up to this, and then share that to come up with an understanding of how this impacts the way they think about national traditions now that they've read the text.
I like Lauren just shared when you were talking about the timeline of the day and how the girls' feelings change over the course of the day. I thought about history and change over time and how the US celebrations of the 4th of July have changed over time. That could be a neat extension lesson, especially relevant as we near the 250th anniversary
Mm.
day. That's so, so great. I want to, so just the key takeaways. I think picture books build knowledge and spark inquiry. They support literacy and social studies together. They're across lessons in this rereading strategy. They really deepen understanding over time, and they allow students to be confident in their practicing their writing and their speaking skills. All of you out there, I've had several questions about slides. I'll have a slide deck for you. I'll have a recording for you. We'll send that out on Tuesday in an email. But right now, I just want to stop my share and then follow up with some questions for you, Janet. I know we only scratched the surface of your your contributions to children's literature. So I would like to ask you, like, we've loved time spending time in this world of the apple pie 4th of July, but you've written so many more other books. Are there any recent or upcoming projects you're excited about that you'd like to share and talk to us about?
Well, specifically with respect to inquiry, I am super proud of our last books. I say our because my first 21 books were published by big publishers like Simon and Schuster and Harcourt. And then 13 years ago, my good friend Sylvia Vardell, who actually is the world's expert on children's poetry, asked me to start publishing anthologies with her. She said, "You know hundreds of poets. I know how to teach poetry. Why don't we create books that are useful to teachers in the classroom?" And our latest two are Clara's Kooky Compendium of Thimble Thoughts and Wonder Fuzz, and then the companion book, My Kooky Compendium of Thimble Thoughts and Wonder Fuzz. And these are two words that I made up. Thimble thoughts. Thimble thoughts are little tiny thoughts the size of a fairy thimble, just little tiny things that you know, little tiny facts, random facts. And Wonder Fuzz are little random questions that you have. And I think that the best thing we can do now is to get kids, well, always has been, but especially now, always to get kids to be lifelong learners. We have to get them celebrating the things they know, no matter how small, and get them wondering about more things. So every single page of this book has a Wonder Fuzz question and a little thimble thought on totally random, silly things. We decided we wanted this to be a funny book. And then in My Kooky Compendium, there are actually blank spaces for kids to write in their own lists and things they wonder and little facts that they know. And so please look for those books, because I believe that where your focus is with inquiry is where it's at. We need kids to wonder, and talk about the things that they wonder. So thanks for asking.
Thank you, Kim, for joining us. And
Thanks for
thank
having
you,
me.
Janet.
And thank you, Martin.
Yes,
Yeah.
thanks for helping us.
Yeah. And take care, everybody. And I'll be in touch soon.
Bye.
Bye, guys.